Good morning, good afternoon, good evening from wherever you are tuning in around the world. Thank you for joining us and our global community for today's Returner webinar. I'm Des Martin. I'm one of the team here at Kea, and joining me today are a panel of speakers from Mobile Relocations, BDO, and a recently returned member of our Kea community. Just some quick housekeeping before we start. This webinar will be recorded and we'll share it on our website and through our social channels, along with some links to some additional resources. So keep an eye out for those coming up in the next couple of days, and you can share that. Or for those of you who have registered and aren't able to join us live, thank you also for registering to receive that information as well. Just a bit of a background to Kea. We are a not-for-profit organisation which was founded more than 20 years ago to connect Kiwi all around the globe. Today, the Kea community consists of around 500,000 members in 185 countries. Kea works to connect our global Kiwi community to each other and to New Zealand. We support Kiwi export businesses looking to grow globally by connecting them with our community to offer in-market advice and experience. And we work to support our returning Kiwi community who are looking to bring their global learnings and expertise back to New Zealand. And so that brings us to today's webinar, where we'll be answering some key questions about the process of returning home to New Zealand after being overseas. So joining us on the call today, we have our three fantastic panelists. First up is Bridget. She is the founder of Mobile Relocations, a company that provides expert support for both the logistical and emotional facets of moving to New Zealand, including shipping, finding a property, as well as settling into new communities. We have Shaneen, who is a tax partner from BDO and a self-professed tax nerd or specialist tax advisor. With more than 20 years experience working in New Zealand and the United Kingdom, and with speciality in migrant tax advisory and planning. And Scott Maud, who has recently returned from offshore postings. He's been overseas twice in his life, once by himself and second time coming back with a family, and can speak to the realities of returning home and settling back into the local life. Thank you everyone for joining us.
Kia ora koutou, thank you.
Oh. Well, my first question to all three of you, but we'll start with you, Scott, is just tell us a little bit about your expat experience and coming back to New Zealand.
Yeah, so I first went overseas in 2008, and when I went over, I went to the UK, based in London. I thought I was going to go away for 3 or 4 years, and ended up being away for 8 years. And I had a fantastic time, and I'll talk more about that through the session today. And then I actually went back again to London during COVID in 2021. And so I went back for a couple of years and then came back at the end of 22. So yeah, I've done it twice. And as you say, the second time I came back, well, I took a family abroad and then I brought my family home. So the transition was quite different both times, but you know, I thoroughly enjoyed my time overseas, and would do it again, and would promote it to everyone who's excited about it. And also coming back to New Zealand's been a great experience as well. So we'll talk to that too.
That's fantastic. And how about you, Shaneen? You spent some time overseas, didn't you?
First of all, thank you for overseas experience. After finished my degree and got professional qualifications, I got the itch to travel. So I bought a one-way ticket to London in 2007. Unfortunately, I landed there just as GFC started. So it was a difficult period for me. I mean, don't get me wrong, London was amazing. Europe was so beautiful. It's just the economic environment, the work environment wasn't the most easiest to work in. So I came back to New Zealand around 2009, and I've been back ever since then. I've been dreaming of back one day, but unlike Scott, I didn't get my second chance to go back.
Yeah, we all dream of going overseas again, I'm sure, at some point. And Bridget, how about you?
Yeah, thanks, Des. I say I started my expat experience, like many Aucklanders, by going away to university at the age of 17. In my case, I went to the end of New Zealand, to Otago, as far as I could get, completely different culture. But I was hungry for it at that age, and I kind of continued on. I joined the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Trade as a diplomat, and I had postings in India and Singapore. And during that time, I unwittingly, unknowingly, throws you in various directions. I ended up traversing every facet of the expat experience, from going overseas as a single woman to having a partner who was and wasn't working, to then going to Singapore with both my husband and I. So we were a dual career partnership going overseas. I had a couple of children overseas, and then started a business. And so for a while I was what you call a trailing spouse. I was not the one who was in charge. I was just there with my partner. And in the course of all of that, we repatriated to New Zealand twice. The last time I came back with 2 small children and pregnant with a third, to a country where I had never given birth, had no idea about bringing children up in New Zealand. So it was almost like being an expat who wasn't from New Zealand coming back into that environment.
Yeah, no, such a diverse range of experience from all of you as well. So it'll be great to get your insights. Just a reminder to everyone, as we're going to kick into the more formal questions now. Just a reminder, if you do have questions that come up during the webinar, type them into that Q&A box. We will come to them at the end. And I do have a few that people have also pre-asked as well. So we will get to those at the end. But just a reminder, that Q&A box is there. So please do use it as we go through the webinar. First question now is for you, Scott. That first, the first part of really, coming home is deciding to come home. Can you tell us about that process for you, and what influenced that decision, and how did you know it was the right time?
So I am very comfortable calling New Zealand home, and I always had an intention to come home. I guess it was just a question of what was the right time. And as I said in the intro there, I went overseas the first time to London expecting to be away for a few years, and I ended up being away for 8 years. I guess the decision to move home after that period of time was based around the fact that while London did feel like my home at that point, I always knew I wanted to spend a large part of the rest of my life in New Zealand, love New Zealand. And I felt like on balance, I'd achieved everything I wanted to achieve overseas. From a career perspective, from a cultural perspective, travel and all those things. And I sort of had this desire to come back and, experience the New Zealand life. The other factor at that point was actually quite a practical one. My wife and I were expecting our first baby, and we sort of had this moment where it was a decision around, do we want to have children in the UK or come home and sort of anchor down here? And that was what we decided to do. The second time, my shift overseas was very much based around the job I was doing at the time. I was working for an international business, and during COVID, New Zealand was pretty much shut, and I couldn't get in and out. I had to spend a lot of time in the US and the UK. And I had a UK passport from the first time I'd gone over, and it was very easy to leave New Zealand and go to the UK during COVID with a passport. And so went over for that purpose. And at that stage, I, again, always did intend to come home. And when the business affairs for the business I was working with got to a stage where it was like, right, I've kind of achieved everything I want to at this point, again, made that decision to come back. So it was, it was quite logical steps, but I think the point is I have always felt like New Zealand would be my eventual home, and making sure that I felt like I'd accomplished everything I wanted to achieve overseas before making that decision. Having said that, though, it's always a trade-off, and you sit here thinking, is the grass greener overseas? And we'll talk a bit about looking for jobs in New Zealand, and as you go through that process, the mind often wanders. But I think, you're often just going to make a commitment and run with your gut.
Yeah, no, that absolutely makes sense. And so, Bridget, once people do make that decision to leave, practically speaking, what are some of the key things they should start thinking about?
Yeah, I really agree with Scott. Just to go back there, you go with your gut about coming home, and then you think, oh my God, how am I going to organize all of this? But help is at hand. If you'd like to go onto our website, I'm going to talk about this, but we have, which you might be able to see there, a Move to New Zealand checklist that you can download. Now, because what's really important is to get your mindset right. Okay, this is a really big job, moving home. It is going to take time. It is going to take energy. It's worth putting some effort into timing and preparation. This is probably not so much the case if it's just you and your backpack, but certainly if you've got anything like a life you need to transfer back, there's quite a lot to do. So the way we look at it is there are 3 different steps. The first step that you need to take is looking at the practicalities. So that's things even like, how can you get out of your lease and your property in London? You're going to have to give notice, managing little things like that, through to your pets. Big decisions there. can you rehome them? Can you bring them back? What's it going to cost? That is a big factor, very expensive. And again, then there's a whole lot of logistics that unfold in terms of getting the approvals and the vaccinations done. So there's a whole lot of practicalities that you need to start working on. The second step we suggest is to look at researching all the logistics. So this is all the things like, if you have a partner who's not a New Zealander, got to get going on their partnership visa so they can work. And important to do that because it's really going to be important for your spouse, for their identity, to have their job sorted out. Don't leave that to the last minute. It's not as if they can't come into the country, because they can come with you, but they won't be able to work unless they have the correct visa. Things like shipping, obviously, which I'll come into in a bit more detail in a minute. Education in New Zealand for your children. Do a bit of research. For me, for example, I had no idea. I'd just gone to school where my parents told me to go to school, all those years ago. So I needed to understand the New Zealand education system. And then employment. Scott's going to talk a little bit about that, but really the best thing you can be doing before you come is rebuilding your networks. Jump on LinkedIn, call everybody you know, and just start work on that. So really seems like a small thing, but it will reap huge dividends. And I'm sure Scott will talk about that as well. And then not the third piece, because this almost needs to be happening simultaneously with the rest of it, is thinking about the emotions around this. Okay, you've had your gut instinct to come home. That's what you're going to do. But what is that really going to mean for you? I'm going to talk about reverse culture shock a little bit later on. But think about having a good departure from where you are now. You've lived in that place for a while. You've enjoyed it. Make sure that you have some farewell events to say goodbye to people. Make sure your children have some memories to take back of their school and their friends. All these little things contribute to your well-being when you actually get back to New Zealand and through the process. And then I just want to talk very quickly about shipping, because that is usually people's number one question. And I'm going to be a little bit controversial here and say, don't let it be your number one question, because it seems very important when you're leaving where you are to have everything packed up and taken with you like a snail in its shell. But once you get to New Zealand, half of that stuff won't be unpacked. You might not even like some of it. Will have cost you a fortune. That's over. But you do need, if you are shipping back, just treat it as another logistical exercise. You need to find out how long it's going to take and be prepared for that to be an estimate only, not accurate, because the shipping companies can't control what happens with transshipment and delays and having to go through the Red Sea or not through the Red Sea. So just try and be chill about that. Don't track it every second. Get a couple of quotes. Consider how much you want to bring back, what you really need to bring, and be, relatively ruthless about that. And then my third tip is air freight. Unaccompanied air freight is actually quite an economical way of sending things that you need to have sooner rather than later, like off-season clothes. It takes about 2 weeks, cheaper than extra bags, and much less hassle than sending things by sea. So over to you, Des.
Oh, fantastic, Bridget. That's great. And now one thing that some people might not really think about when they're planning to move home is tax. Shaneen, what are some of the key things that people need to think about before they make their move?
I think the starting point is that New Zealand taxes its residents on their worldwide income. So be prepared to be subject to New Zealand tax on your worldwide income. Now, I'm a firm believer that everyone should pay their fair share of tax, but not pay for more than what they're required to pay. So it's good to be aware of any tax exemptions that may be available. And one such exemption for migrant is the transitional tax residency exemption. So this is available for individuals who have been away from New Zealand, so originally a Kiwi, who has been away for more than 10 years, or new to New Zealand migrants. And what it means is, if you qualify, then for the first 4 years of your arrival in New Zealand, or for the first 4 years of you gaining New Zealand tax residency, foreign source income is not subject to New Zealand tax. Now, this exemption does not apply to employment income or personal services income. Those will continue to be subject to New Zealand tax regardless of where it is sourced. The exemption obviously does not apply to New Zealand source income. So if you derive interest, dividend, or any other source from New Zealand, they will continue to be subject to New Zealand. So that's all well and good. But tax is probably the last thing you want to think about when you are packing up your things and getting ready to move to a new country or come back to New Zealand. But what I would encourage returning Kiwis or new migrants to do as well is think about the assets that you want to hold onto. So, for example, rental, shares, crypto, superannuation, etc. Have a good think about whether or not it makes sense to keep them or if you should liquidate them before you migrate to New Zealand. If you want to hold to them, evaluate it from a financial perspective. What's your expected return from the asset? What is the tax cost involved in holding onto the assets? So if you think about tax costs, that's the tax liability that you have to pay. Now, usually in tax, we look at from two angles. One is what we call the source country. So that's tax in the country where the assets based. And the other one is what we call the residence country. So that's tax paid that you are a resident in. So both countries would seek to tax the return that you receive from that particular asset. So you say you are keeping shares or superannuation in London and you're coming back to New Zealand. Now, suddenly UK and New Zealand both have interest in taxing that income. So you then have to look at the double tax treaty and decide who has the primary taxing right, who has the secondary taxing right. But it still doesn't provide you with relief from having to file tax returns in both countries. And that's another headache of the boat. So all in all, have a look at all of that and go, is this holding on to this asset, is it going to cause me more headache in the long run than what it's worth? I think foreign superannuation is a particular asset that has caused headache for a lot of our clients, and we will come to that later. So I think overall, have a think about the assets that you're holding on to. If you qualify for the transitional tax residency exemption, brilliant. Use the first 4 years to decide if you want to keep the asset or not. If you don't qualify, then please make a call before you come back.
Okay, great. Important things to think about. So Scott, coming back to you, when it became time to actually pack up and move home, what was that experience like?
It's a lot. I mean, both times was a lot. The second time with a family was also obviously a lot plus. And so, like, don't underestimate it. You kind of, we've talked about, Bridget talked a lot about the relocation. We're just talking about the tax stuff. Like, there's so many aspects to this, and we have a spreadsheet of everything that was going to be. Of course, I had a spreadsheet. I'm an accountant, so that was the natural place to go to plan this move back. I guess the key things to consider were like picking the right time, and just simple stuff like when's the right time to exit the role you're in whatever country you're in overseas, and is that the right time to look for a role back in New Zealand, and can you go for a period of time without income, and are you prepared for that? And the shipping point, which has been touched on as well, it's a big cost. We actually did jam our coffee machine into the plane because we wanted that sooner than waiting 3 or 4 months for it to come. That was quite precious to us. So yeah, that's relevant. Like, it is cheaper it's economical to get stuff home that way if you want it quickly rather than the uncertainty of so many months. And the other thing, and obviously just talking about all the tax planning, like that is quite a big deal. I've ended up with tax affairs in both countries, and I have to pay an accountant to help me with that to get it done. And not just the tax affairs, the pension stuff as well, just being aware of how all that works. So it's multifaceted, and like there'd be lots of pieces to sort of go into there. But I guess the point is, don't underestimate it and plan really well. But having said that, it's like it's all fairly logical and simple stuff. It just takes time.
Yeah. And just a follow-up for you, Scott, because you did move home the 2 times particularly, was there anything that you noticed that were sort of different between those experiences?
Yeah, I mean, like the cost of shipping had gone through the roof between the first time and the second time. I'm not sure where it sits now. We probably moved back at a peak of the market. I think moving back the second time with the family, there was a lot of consideration around schooling and the right way to transition the kids. It happened that our kids, my youngest, had started school in the UK when he was 4, but couldn't actually start in New Zealand until he was 5. So there was this period where he had to like go back to daycare, and that was pretty messy. Didn't like that. So quite practical differences between the first and second time. But again, you just have to kind of be thorough in your planning and think of all the things which could be different, because they probably are.
No, that's great. And Bridget, for those who are moving home and they don't necessarily already have a house or a home to return to, what are some of the options there for finding a property, and what should they think about when considering where to live?
Yeah, excellent question, because, you know, if you think of Maslow's hierarchy of needs, right at the bottom of that is food, shelter, and clothing. So it's really important emotionally and practically to have a home. So if you're sitting offshore, I guess there are two immediate choices. One is, do you rent or do you buy? And there are pros and cons for both. You know, renting obviously gives you the opportunity to make sure that you've actually landed in the right area. Family and friends will say, oh yes, there's a house just down the road from me. And you might start that and it might be fantastic or it might not. But if you bought that house, it's a lot harder to get out of it than it is if you're renting. Renting's obviously, the con of that is that you're spending money that you may not need to be spending if you can afford to buy. And of course, renting in New Zealand is very different to renting in many other countries in terms of the quality of housing. So for most people, say coming from the UK or the US, you're having a downgrade in heating. I can say that, you know, with almost certainty. So those are some little inconveniences you might have to accept for that flexibility. Important to remember, of course, for school zones, for schools, you have to have a year-long rental agreement. So temporary accommodation doesn't get you into a school in most cities in New Zealand, certainly in Auckland. Then there's the option of buying. Now, that's doable too. You sacrifice some flexibility. You make a gain probably financially. We bought a house remotely with my mother's assistance when we came back from overseas, with 2 small children, and I was pregnant, and we just thought we've just got to have a home. Actually, my husband went into this very kind of quite unusual for him, sort of, father provider thing, because we were going to rent and then found out we were pregnant. No, we have to buy a house. So that worked out fine. But it does have its cons as well. So my advice, based on working with many, many expats over the last 8 years of running our business, is I would err towards the side of flexibility and renting, unless you feel very strongly about buying. And then if you do want to buy, obviously you're going to need to reactivate your relationship with your New Zealand bank if you need a mortgage, and a mortgage broker is probably quite a good idea if you're coming back from overseas too, because your finances they're not as simple as they are for a person who's lived in New Zealand the whole time, and a broker can sometimes help you sort of package that up and work with a lender successfully. And then if you decide you want to just come back and wing it, then, Airbnb is great. That's what we put a lot of our clients into. You can even move around a few different areas and test them out. So that's quite a good option, a little bit more expensive, but if you want the ultimate flexibility, that's the thing to do. And I suppose the fourth option, which we've exercised, is staying with family, which doesn't, depending on your family, for us, it was a short-term rather than a long-term option, but it's always there. And then you asked a question too, which is a really good one, about, how do you make this decision where you're going to live? I mean, I suppose that the 4 most basic factors to consider are where you're going to be working, or where you think you're going to be working, in relation to the commute. And bear in mind that may well have changed since you left. If you've been away for a while, the commuting may have changed. There may now be public transport options that weren't there before. In Auckland, certainly the train system's improved a lot. On the other hand, the traffic has got worse. So just make sure you understand that. The second thing to consider is your lifestyle. Most people who are coming back to New Zealand, they're coming back for lifestyle and family. All the Kea data shows that. So proximity to family or not is a consideration. And also, if your big driver is to come back and spend a lot of time at the beach, or to go tramping or whatever, or go to the theatre, think about that in relation to where you're going to be living, so that it's accessible to the kind of lifestyle you want. And again, that's important if you've got children. If you envisage your children having certain activities, just, see if you can find out where those are in relation to where you're going to live. And then the other factor, of course, is the school zones. And again, I was ignorant of all this. Just went to school where I was told when I went to school. You can download a zone map quite easily for each school, and on the Ministry of Education website you can see that too, just so that you don't buy a house in an area which is not where you want your children to go to school. And again, that sort of thing comes into choosing a rental property, but I think for most people, doing that when you arrive, although it seems inconvenient, just brings all those decisions together. You can actually see things on the spot. You can go and visit the schools. You can go and see the local soccer club, if that's what your child's really into, and use that information to guide your decision making. I think the holy grail is if you can manage to get back with your partner or without for even a week or something, perhaps without children if you've got children, and get all that done. That is really effective, but it's not practical for everybody. So most people end up doing that sort of as they're arriving and settling in. Quite an intense period. Scott may have some comments on that too.
Yes, fantastic. Coming to you, Shaneen, we talked earlier about foreign superannuation. If someone is a member of a foreign super scheme and they migrate to New Zealand, what do they need to be aware of?
New Zealand's going to tax it. I think that's the short and simple answer. So in terms of foreign super, there's a distinction between what we call the lump sum withdrawal from a foreign superannuation versus ongoing pension or annuity payment that you receive from a foreign super. So the first one I want to cover is a lump sum withdrawal. So lump sum withdrawal includes situations where you do cash withdrawal from your foreign superannuation, as well as a transfer from one superannuation scheme to another superannuation scheme. So the following applies if you join the superannuation when you were a non-resident. It doesn't apply. What I'm going to talk about next is not going to apply if you joined the super while you were a New Zealand resident. So for a foreign superannuation, from 1st of April 2014 onward, you will be taxed on lump sum withdrawals when you make the withdrawal in New Zealand. The longer you are in New Zealand, so the longer it has been since you returned to New Zealand or since you migrate to New Zealand, the greater amount is that you have to pay tax on. So the percentage that you are taxed on actually increases proportionally to the number of years you've been back in New Zealand. Now, there are exemptions for Australian schemes. We like Australians. And there's also exemptions for new residents in their first 4 years of arrival in New Zealand. So for someone who's first came back to New Zealand or first joined New Zealand, for the first 4 years, the withdrawal is not subject to New Zealand tax. So the second category of payments from superannuation is pensions and annuities. So that's ongoing payment you receive from super. Those generally are taxed on receipt. Now, if New Zealand has a double tax agreement with the country where the scheme is based, then it will likely be that there will be double tax relief available. So you are only taxed once, either the country where the super scheme is based or in New Zealand.
That's great. Excuse me. And following on from that, once someone has arrived back into New Zealand, what do they need to do to make sure that they are tax compliant?
So I think there are a couple of things. Come to mind. The first one and the easiest one is get an IRD number. So if you're a returning Kiwi, usually most people will already have an IRD number, but so IRD will have a record. So in that case, it would be as easy as call IRD, reactivate that number, tell them you're back in the country, and you're all sorted. Now, if you're a new migrant to New Zealand, then you will need to apply for an IRD number. There's usually two ways to apply for it. One is if you're onshore, so physically based in New Zealand when you made the application, and the second one is when you're offshore when you made the application. Now, I usually encourage everyone to prepare before they migrate, but getting an IRD number is one where it's easier done if you are physically based in New Zealand. And the reason for that is when you apply for an IRD number, they need to verify your ID. So they actually need to see a passport or driver license, see that you are who you are, and they also need to see an address, proof of address. So if you are based in New Zealand, when you made the application, you can just go to a New Zealand Post or an AA outlet, show them your passport, show them your proof of address. They put a stamp on a piece of paper, send it off to IRD. A couple of days, you get an ID number, easy. But if you're based offshore, then it's quite difficult for you to complete that KYC process, know your client process, because you need to find someone who can complete the CDD, put a stamp on the piece of paper, and then verify you are who you are, verify your passport, and then stamp it on and then send it to IRD. So it is more difficult to do when you're offshore. It can be done, but if you can get away with it, try to do it when you're in.
Yeah.
Now, the second thing I will also say is, after getting your ID number, then the second thing to do is tax returns. Now, New Zealand tax year starts from 1 April and finishes on 31st of March the following year. And for an individual, they will need to file their return on 7th of July after the 31st of March. That is unless you have an accountant or tax agent, in which case you get further time to file. You have until 31st of March the following year. For most people who only derive employment income, it is quite straightforward to file your return. Sorry, that's on the assumption that your employer withholds payroll tax, what we call PAYE in New Zealand, and pays it to IRD. that at the end of the year, those who only derive employment income will just go to IRD website, verify that everything is correct and done. But if you have anything other than employment income, then you are likely required to file a New Zealand tax return. And in that situation, especially for those in the first few years, I would recommend that you get an accountant or tax advisor to help you prepare that, just to make sure that you get it right. The third thing, and this is something that catches a few of our clients by surprise, commencement date for tax residency. So generally in New Zealand, there's two tests for tax residency. The first one is what we call the 183-day test, and the second one is the PPOA, or permanent place of abode test. And in individuals, tax residency commences on the earlier of these two dates. So the 183-day test means that your residency commences on the first day of the 183 days that you are physically present in New Zealand for a rolling 12-month period. So the rolling 12-month means any day that starts on the first day you step foot into New Zealand. And that sometimes catches out our client by surprise, because sometimes some clients, they will come in, do a school visit, stay in a few places, and decide where they would like to stay in, and then go back to their home country, think about it, maybe after 3 to 6 months, decide, yeah, I think New Zealand is the place to go, then come back to New Zealand. Now, in those situations, if you count the days, it may be that the 183 days actually commenced when they first made their visit to New Zealand. And that's actually the trigger for New Zealand tax residency. So just be aware of that. The second test for residency is the permanent place of abode test. So that's where you have a home in New Zealand, and the home includes a rental, and that is a place where you have an enduring connection. So if you have a home in New Zealand, that will also trigger New Zealand tax residency, and you'll be deemed to be a New Zealand tax resident from the day you have home. So the earlier of the 183 days, or the permanent place of abode test test is when you have a New Zealand tax residency. So for most people, they will qualify for that, qualifies for transitional residency. That will also define the start and end date for your concessional transitional period.
Yeah, fantastic. Speaking of permanent places of abode, Scott, how did you go about settling back into New Zealand and making those, new friends, or re-establishing like friends and business connections?
There's a lot to sort of cover in that. So obviously I came back from London to New Zealand, and New Zealand feels very different to London. It's obviously, it really does feel much smaller, and there's like a lot less going on. So again, as I said earlier, you've got to be ready to make this jump. And I think the thing is to focus on all the good stuff that's in New Zealand, which is way better than London, and not the stuff that you're missing overseas. In terms of friend networks, I had a good friend network here from having gone to school and university and starting my career here. But I guess on reflection over the last few years, the network of parents I meet through my children's school is a great place to meet people. Kiwis are pretty friendly people, so easy to sort of build out your network that way. I think once like I said before, you've got to be ready to come back. It feels like the scale of what's going on in New Zealand relative to somewhere like London is less than half. It probably feels like a quarter. So it's just not as vibrant in terms of that cultural engagement you can get in London. But there is a bit going on in New Zealand still. There are cool things to chase down in terms of nice new restaurants opening and obviously all the outdoor living. I spent, and you kind of asked about business connections there. I spent a lot of time thinking about this as in the context of my career. And waiting for the right role that I wanted to take. I spent about a year waiting for the right thing to come out. That wasn't that I was probably particularly fussy about what I wanted. It's not to say there's not lots of opportunities. There are quite a few opportunities there. I think, if I'm honest, the employment market is soft at the moment. But last year when I was looking, it was better. So just keep that in mind. Hopefully it changes next year. But if you have a lower risk tolerance, there's lots of opportunities to take. But for me, waiting for the right one that ticked all the boxes, it did take some time. And that's a function of New Zealand being smaller. There's just not the scale and not the breadth of opportunities that you see overseas. I think the way to be successful in that space is you can quite quickly cover the market in New Zealand if you leverage your networks. And I think Bridget touched on it earlier, like New Zealand's small. It's obviously cliche to say that everyone knows everyone, but it's kind of true. And you leverage the networks you've got, and don't be afraid of it. I'm a little bit introverted naturally, and I don't like putting myself out there, but I encourage you just to put yourself out there outside your comfort zone. And it really does work. Everyone introduces you to people they know, and you quite quickly get a feel for where those business opportunities will come out. And then I think the other thing I've noticed versus the first time I was away and coming back is there's a fantastic startup scene in New Zealand now, and there are lots of really successful companies coming through, and I see them as creating a lot of employment opportunities, particularly in the tech space. And so like that's an interesting part to sort of try and build out your business connections, and they are businesses that cover all aspects of industries and have lots of different roles in them. So there'd be stuff in those businesses to suit lots of people. So, you know, there's a lot to think about in there. I guess I'd summarize it as to say it's obviously very different coming home, focusing on the good things. It's a little bit unsettling, but you'll get there in the end.
Yeah. And Bridget, similar sort of question to you. What are some of the main concerns that you're hearing from the clients that you work with?
There's that gut feeling, I want to come home. Then there's the, oh my God, what have I done? And then dealing with the emotional side of things. And Des, would you mind just popping up that slide there? And I'm sort of going to start at the beginning of the point that Scott just made. It'll be all right in the end. Now, it probably won't be all right at some points when you come back. And I'm saying that with all honesty and with a degree of comfort, because this phases of relocation slide that we've just put up there is really heavily researched by a well-known cross-cultural expert called Hofstadter, interviewed many expats all over the world over a period of years. And I wish I had known about this when I was overseas, and with some of my returns as well, because when things are not going well, you start doubting yourself and you think, oh my God, I can't adjust to New Zealand, something about me, or, there's something wrong, I've made a terrible decision, I'm going to run back again. And it's just not a healthy place to be. So I think understanding these phases you're likely to go through will make a big difference. So I'm just going to quickly talk through this. So most people, if you look over on the left-hand side, the peak there, are in a honeymoon period when they first come back. Finally, they've got that grandparent to provide childcare they've been dreaming about in London for many years. And the sun's shining and they can go to the beach and all of these things they wanted to do. So that's when the reasons you came back are in technicolor in front of your eyes. It's all wonderful. Most people then work their way down into a slump, which on this graph is labeled culture shock and disillusionment at number 2 there. And that's where the gloss wears off and you start to think, oh my God, I left where I left because I wasn't super happy about this, but gosh, it's the same in New Zealand, or the driving here is terrible, or there aren't the cultural opportunities. And it's your perspective, really. You're seeing the negatives more than you're seeing the positives, and the differences between where you've been and where you are now are very stark, and your mind is rebelling against that, and you're in reverse culture shock or disillusionment. The good news is that the vast majority of people then have a bit of a reckoning, and they go through that acculturation phase at 3 there, where they come to terms with it. They keep their big goal in mind, as Scott mentioned. What is the reason why you decided to come home? They get used to some stuff. They discover some new stuff. They start to make some friends and social connections, because often the culture shock disillusionment is when you find yourself in a little bit of a lonely place as well. And then you end up in a sort of a stability phase where you're glad you came back to New Zealand, you realise there's some stuff you left behind, and your life, most importantly, is pretty much back to normal, because part of the overlay during periods 1 and 2 is that your life's really disrupted. You may not know exactly where you're going to be living, you're waiting for your stuff to arrive, you're reconnecting with your old friends. There's not much stability in your life, and that makes it quite hard. So just to wrap up there, I think the key point is to recognise that there will be tough periods as part of your relocation to New Zealand, not to shy away from that. It will happen, it will and recognise it. And as a very practical piece of advice, I say to people, print this out, stick it on your fridge or somewhere that's obvious in your house, so that all of your family's aware of it. You can support each other through it. different people in the family will go through it at different times too. So you might be having a really bad day and your partner's not, and they can support you, or the kids will come home from school. They'll have bad days. They'll have days where they come back and say, I want to go back to where I was before. But that helps you all keep it in perspective in a more successful way.
Yeah, perfect. Shaneen, what are some of the common issues that you see people encounter, or they might find surprising?
I think the couple I would like to mention. The first one is dual tax residency. So this can occur, for example, where you have a family and one partner that comes to New Zealand to work for a period of time, find a house, settle down, while the second partner stays behind in the original country, waiting for the children to finish their school years before they join the first partner in New Zealand. And now in this situation, you are potentially in the dual tax residency zone, because the partner that is in New Zealand has a home in New Zealand as well as a home in the original country. Both countries will see that the individual has two homes, will want to claim that the individual is a terrorist resident in that country. So a lot of countries have double tax treaties with New Zealand, and double tax treaty does deal with the situation by operating what we call a tiebreaker to give tax residency to one particular country over another. So in that situation, it can be dealt with, but just be aware that that is something that can occur if you're relocating and you have that situation. The other situation we've seen quite often is when New Zealand-based employee of an overseas employer. So think about a situation where you can be seconded to work in New Zealand for an offshore country for a while, or more likely, for lifestyle reasons, you decide to relocate back to New Zealand, but continue to work remotely for your offshore employer. Now, depending on the nature of your work and how long you plan to live in New Zealand, your presence in New Zealand may trigger a New Zealand tax risk for your offshore employer. So your offshore employer might suddenly find that they have a permanent establishment in New Zealand, and might suddenly find that they have a permanent withholding tax obligation in New Zealand. So those are things to be aware of, and it would be good if that's to have a discussion with your employer, rather than them getting an envelope and getting a surprise after you spending time in Zealand. Now, the third one that I would like to mention is trust. In New Zealand, trusts are taxed very differently from the rest of the world. New Zealand taxes trust based on residency status of the settlor. And the settlor is defined as a person who has settled a trust, as well as a person who has transferred anything of value to a trust. Now, if the settlor relocates to New Zealand, then the trust can be deemed to be a New Zealand settlor trust. And a New Zealand settlor trust will be subject to New Zealand tax reporting obligations, New Zealand tax filing obligations, and in certain situations may have New Zealand tax. So if you are relocating to New Zealand, migrating to New Zealand, and you have a trust that you've settled, please talk to a tax advisor. Actually, you've got that sorted.
Yeah. And Bridget, are there any other common pitfalls or surprises that your clients encounter?
Yeah, I'd just like to highlight two things. One is not planning for your life as it is now when you return. So our typical client is a Kiwi who's lived overseas for more than 10 years. They usually have children who were born overseas, and they often have a spouse who is also not a New Zealand national. So they have typically visited New Zealand on holiday, had a fabulous time, been the celebrities of their families, and that scenario is quite different to the way they left New Zealand, which is usually with a backpack, and they need to plan for that new life in New Zealand, because generally they're moving back primarily for lifestyle reasons, and it's really important that they create the life that they envisage, and that takes quite a lot of work and planning when you've actually got no background in living that life in New Zealand, because when you left, your life was completely different. So just think that through. Secondly is reverse culture shock. I think this has become a lot more talked about since the vast influx of over 50,000 Kiwis during COVID, but I just quickly want to touch on that. You're changed by your life living overseas. You know, I say that without doubt. There are new things that trigger you. There are new things that are normal to you that are not normal to your friends and family back in New Zealand. You are a different person to the one who was when you left. Yet you're coming back to a New Zealand which has in some ways moved on, but often in some ways seems pretty much the same, and your friends and family may not understand the full depth of the person that you are now. And that can be, difficult. We've talked before about some of the adjustments in life, like having to understand schooling, etc. But there's also an adjustment in mindset. And where this shows up for expats is it can be quite challenging to your self-esteem. Little things like when you lived in your country overseas, your credit rating may have been stellar after 10 years in that place, but you come back to New Zealand and suddenly the bank's saying, oh, show us your source of funds. And, oh, no, we don't like the look of that. And it is, you're used to that sort of thing just happening for you, and it doesn't anymore. That's quite challenging to self-esteem. Even little things like, for me, turning up and not understanding the school zoning system, I felt like an idiot. Whereas all the other parents, oh yes, you've got to be in this zone. Oh, you're in that street. Oh no, that's not such a good one. And it's all the stuff that was second nature for you, but now isn't. And then secondly, that sense of belonging, finding your tribe. You've got your family and friends who are going to be certainly around for you, but you're probably going to need a little bit of a different tribe as well. So my final piece of advice is expect culture shock to happen, like the relocation cycle. Don't feel like you always have to be happy and raving about New Zealand all the time and just telling people that you're so happy. Don't tell everybody that you may be finding it challenging, but do find a group of fellow expats, whether they're returned Kiwis or others who've lived overseas and moved to New Zealand, who share your experience. People who have also got a diverse background, they are going to be your best supports through the process of reverse culture shock. Thanks, Des.
Well, that's really great advice. And our last sort of question in our sort of formal questions is for you, Scott, and it is, what is that, is the one thing that you know now you wish you'd known before you left?
There's probably two things. It probably connects to what Shaneen was talking about, actually. I wish I'd known more about the pension relationship between the UK and New Zealand. There's this period of, Shaneen mentioned it already, there's like a tax-free period of 4 years when you can come back and you can transfer your, this is not advice, by the way, you can transfer your pension to a qualifying scheme in New Zealand and you get that tax-free period. In hindsight, it looks like I should have pushed more into my pension in the UK to take advantage of that than I did. So if there's, again, people should explore the opportunity to, is there merit in pushing more into your pension voluntarily in the UK while you're there? I don't know how it works in other countries, and then taking advantage of that when you come home. The other thing I'd say is it's not so much I wish I'd known, but it's something that it's probably exceeded expectations coming home, is that openness and willingness of the community to network with you. And again, I said it above, like, keep your networks live and put yourself out there. Don't ever burn bridges, because New Zealand's pretty small. And I think I put myself out there, and now I see people coming back from overseas, and I'm more than willing to help them with the connections I can share. So a couple of points there which I'd reflect on as I've moved home.
Yeah, no, that's fantastic. Well, so that's the end of our formal questions. We have had a couple of questions come in through the Q&A. So for anyone who is on, if you do have a question that you'd like to ask, now's the sort of last chance to get that in. But we did have a few questions as well that came in with people as they registered. So we're going to jump into a couple of those. And I'm going to put this to you, Scott. Is that question of finding a job before you come home. How did you sort of find that process looking around? Do you find it's easier to work with recruiters or go direct or use your network, or what's the sort of what did you find as a good approach there?
So I would be looking for work on all of those fronts, using the recruiters, leveraging your network. I didn't find either of my jobs while I was in New Zealand while I was overseas. So I came home not actually knowing what I was going to do. Some people are able to do that. I wasn't. But yeah, making sure you're looking on all those fronts and following what's going on Seek and LinkedIn, because New Zealand's quite small. You just need to look everywhere.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. Bridget, a question I'll put to you is, obviously for people when they're returning from overseas, they've got to juggle working across different time zones. They're obviously dealing with people in their home time zone, trying to speak to people in New Zealand. Is there any sort of tips or tricks or anything you can give in terms of managing that process when it's around the globe?
Yeah, that's my life. I I have a great app which you can put in 2 countries and find out when the green zone is, when you're both going to be awake. That's really useful. Apart from that, I think it's just something that you're going to have to accept and work with. There's nothing we can do about that. In fact, it's actually quite an interesting wake-up call for people to realize it sheets home the distance that you're going to face when you get back to New Zealand, which for me, even coming back from Singapore where the time difference is not that great, I felt such a long way from the rest of the world when I got home again. You're used to sort of flying to another country for a weekend. You just don't do that. So I think, try and just work your way through the practicalities of it, but in fact, realize that that's just what life's going to hold for you. And if you're continuing to hold a global role or have global relationships, that will be part of your work life going forward. Not very comfortable, but it's reality.
Yeah, I was going to add to that, I think this is actually one of the hardest things about running an international business from New Zealand is the time zone management. And I ended up working Monday through Saturday morning often, which was painful, and doing calls late at night. So be awake to that. It's a challenge from here.
Yeah, certainly it is. You notice that distance when you hear from New Zealand and you're doing your Zoom calls at 10 o'clock at night. Another question, I guess, for you, Scott, is around that overseas experience. How do you find employers in New Zealand sort of view that experience compared to people who have maybe only worked in New Zealand?
On balance, let's say they view it positively. New Zealand companies, most of them want to grow internationally. And so if you can bring experience from those markets back and leverage that and present that really well as you get to know these businesses and looking for jobs, that will be looked on positively. So no obstacles. In fact, it's a good thing. I think on balance, though, you wouldn't want to just come home and be ramming international experience down their throat the whole time, because you'd want to actually be making it look like you're really wanting to be in New Zealand and wanting to be part of the New Zealand business. So I think it's a good thing. And it genuinely is a good thing because there's so much to learn overseas in an accelerated way versus what you could learn in New Zealand.
And just one final question that's here is, around the practicalities of cost of living. Scott, you might be the one to speak to this as well. Where did you find those sort of differences in terms of, particular areas which may have been like more expensive, but other things may have been, cheaper, or does it ultimately just sort of work out similar in the end?
I saw this question in this, I thought about it, and it references fuel, food, and a little bit everywhere, entertainment. All of those things have gone up in New Zealand. One thing I noticed, the first time I was in the UK, the second time I was in the UK, was the UK actually got a lot more expensive and is probably on par with going to the supermarket in New Zealand, at least when I came back last time. I think the most, shocking difference is around how much housing costs and therefore how much debt you potentially need to buy a house. And now that interest rates are high, on a relatively higher amount of debt to buy a house in New Zealand, that probably eats or impacts the cost of living in New Zealand the most. Unfortunately, our housing stock's expensive. Doesn't look like there's any way out of that at the moment.
Can I just add something there, Daz? I think it depends a lot on where you're coming from. For example, some of our clients coming from central London can't believe the cost of rentals in New Zealand is so much cheaper, and the cost of utilities. Whereas people coming from, say, South Africa, everything seems a lot more expensive here. So it's all relative. And also for returning Kiwis, they have the double whammy, as Scott has alluded to, of actually purchasing a house. Most other expats don't have the ability to buy immediately. So while that's an advantage, overall through your life, it does mean that your disposable income is significantly curtailed by the very factors that Scott mentioned.
Yeah, no, that absolutely makes sense. Well, that comes to the end of our webinar now. Thank you everyone for joining us. We hope that was really helpful.